At 71, she forgot the worst day of her life, the day her husband left for work and never came home. For more than 20 years, her son believed it was her fault. He thought if she hadn't asked for more, if she hadn't lived the way she did, his father might still be alive. So little by little, he stopped calling. And she learned to live alone with the silence. Until one quiet morning, she fell. And when she woke up, something had changed. She no longer remembered the pain. She only remembered that she had a son she loved very much. And somehow, that was enough to begin again. Because what happened next would make her son question everything he thought he knew about the day his father died. And if stories like this speak to your heart, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. You're always welcome here. The late autumn air in White Plains carried a quiet, lingering chill, slipping gently through the aging windows of Margaret Collins' home as bare branches swayed under a pale gray sky. The world outside unusually still, as if holding its breath. Margaret Collins, a 71-year-old woman with soft silver-gray hair falling loosely to her shoulders, stood alone in the narrow hallway, one hand resting against the wall for balance. Her pale skin bore the delicate marks of time, fine wrinkles, faint age spots. But it was her eyes that lingered, tired, yet still carrying a softness that refused to fully disappear. She wore a light beige cardigan over a faded blue blouse, the fabric slightly worn, as though it had endured the same quiet years she had. There was a sharpness in her posture, a remnant of the woman she once was, someone composed, controlled, and unwilling to yield. For a moment, she hesitated outside the bathroom door. She had come here for a reason. She was sure of it. But the reason slipped away before she could grasp it. Margaret frowned, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. Forgetfulness was not something she tolerated, not in others, and certainly not in herself. "I'm fine," she whispered, more firmly this time, as if saying it could make it true. Inside, the cold tiles pressed against her bare feet. She reached for the sink, glancing up at her reflection. The woman staring back at her felt unfamiliar. Not entirely a stranger, but not quite someone she recognized either. There had been a time when she cared about appearances, when her hair was styled neatly, when she carried herself with a quiet elegance that drew attention without asking for it. Now, there was only this version of her, smaller, slower, and far more alone. The fall came without warning. Her hands slipped, her balance failed, and suddenly she was on the floor. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, a sharp, unforgiving jolt that echoed through her side. For several seconds she couldn't move, couldn't think, could only stare at the ceiling as the pain slowly settled in. Then came the silence. Margaret lay there, her chest rising unevenly, the cold seeping into her bones. Time lost its shape, minutes stretched, folded, disappeared. The house remained still, as if unaware of what had happened. She could have called someone. There was a phone not far from her reach, but she didn't, not because she believed she was strong, but because, over the years, she had learned something far more dangerous, that asking for help often came with a quiet cost. Being reminded that you were no longer needed, only tolerated. So instead, she moved, slowly, painfully. Her fingers curled against the edge of a cabinet as she dragged herself forward, inch by inch. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her strength fading faster than she expected. Once, she stopped completely, her eyes closing as a wave of dizziness washed over her. "You've been through worse," she murmured, though the words sounded distant, as if spoken by someone else. When she finally reached the hallway, her body gave in. She collapsed against the wall, too exhausted to continue, her limbs heavy, her thoughts beginning to blur. The knock came later. A young delivery worker stood outside, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as he glanced at the small grocery package in his hands. His name tag read Ethan. He looked no older than 22, with short, slightly messy blonde hair and a lean frame that still carried the restless energy of youth. His expression was open, unguarded, the kind of face that hadn't yet learned how to hide concern. "Ma'am?" he called, knocking again, a little louder. No answer. A flicker of unease crossed his face. He tried the handle. Unlocked. Inside, the air felt colder than it should have. Ethan stepped in cautiously, his footsteps soft against the floor as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior. Then he saw her. "Oh!" He dropped the package without thinking and rushed forward. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Margaret's eyes opened slightly, unfocused. "I'm fine." "No, you're not," he said quickly, his voice tightening. "I'm calling an ambulance." She tried to object, to push the words out with the authority she once had, but her hand only lifted weakly before falling back. For the first time in years, someone made a decision for her. The hospital was too bright, too loud, too close. Margaret sat stiffly on the examination bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if holding herself together. The fluorescent lights above cast sharp shadows across her face, highlighting every line, every quiet sign of exhaustion she refused to acknowledge. Dr. Laura Bennett stood across from her, reviewing the chart with practiced calm. She was in her early 50s, her dark hair neatly tied back, her posture composed. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady but gentle, the kind that invited trust without demanding it. "Mrs. Collins," she said, "you're dehydrated, slightly malnourished, and we're seeing early signs of cognitive decline." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't need a lecture." "It's not a lecture," Dr. Bennett replied calmly. "It's information, and right now, you need support." "I don't need anyone." The words came quickly, sharper than intended, familiar, safe. Dr. Bennett studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly. "We'll still need to contact your emergency contact." A pause. Then, "Michael." The name came out quieter than the rest. Miles away, in a modern office lined with glass and steel, Michael Collins glanced at his phone before answering. At 45, he carried himself with controlled restraint. His short, dark hair was neatly kept, faint streaks of gray at the temples. His face was defined by sharp angles, a light stubble framing his jaw, but it was his eyes that gave him away. Tired, guarded, as if he had spent years carefully locking something away. "Yes?" "This is Dr. Bennett from White Plains Hospital. Your mother—" "Is she stable?" he interrupted. "Yes, but—" "Then what's the issue?" His voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm people learned when they stopped allowing themselves to feel too much. "She had a fall," Dr. Bennett said. "There are concerns about her living alone." A brief silence followed. "I'll handle the expenses," Michael replied. "Send me whatever needs to be signed." No questions, no hesitation, no warmth. Later, when Margaret spoke to him, the distance felt even greater. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I didn't." The truth settled between them, cold. "You've always made things harder than they needed to be," he added, almost absent-mindedly. Margaret didn't respond. She simply looked away. He ended the call quickly, not because he didn't care, but because staying any longer might have forced him to. That evening, Margaret returned home. The house was the same, and yet, something felt different. Not louder, not emptier, just unfamiliar. She moved slowly through the living room, her fingers brushing against the furniture as if reacquainting herself with a place she had never truly left. Then she saw it, the coat, dark, slightly worn, hanging exactly where it always had. David's coat. Her expression softened. "You're late," she murmured quietly, stepping closer. For a brief second, it didn't feel like remembering. It felt like he had never left. Then, a flicker, confusion. The moment slipped away before she could hold on to it. Margaret frowned slightly, as if trying to recall something important, but the thought dissolved before it could take shape. She turned away, slowly, carefully, and lowered herself onto the sofa. The exhaustion came quickly this time. Her body surrendered, her breathing softening as sleep pulled her under. Outside, the wind whispered faintly through the empty street. Inside, Margaret Collins slept alone. And somewhere, deep within her mind, a memory had already begun to disappear. Not the painful one, but the one that had kept her angry for all these years. The memory did not return all at once. It surfaced in fragments, quiet, persistent, like something that had never truly left, only been pushed somewhere deeper, waiting for the right moment to be felt again. Years earlier, before the silence took hold of her life, Margaret Collins had been a different woman. In her early 40s, known here as Margaret, she carried herself with a natural elegance that seemed effortless. Her light brown hair was always styled neatly, framing a face that rarely revealed uncertainty, her skin smooth, her posture upright, composed. She was the kind of woman who believed life should follow a certain order, and when it didn't, she felt it as a personal imbalance rather than chance. That morning had begun quietly. Sunlight slipped through the tall windows of their Manhattan apartment, resting gently across polished furniture and carefully arranged spaces. The home reflected Margaret's sense of control, everything deliberate, everything in its place, everything, except the tension that had settled between her and David Collins. David, a 45-year-old man with short salt and pepper hair and a calm, steady presence, stood near the dining table adjusting the cuffs of his white shirt. His features were defined but softened by kindness, the faint lines around his eyes shaped by years of patience rather than stress. He wasn't a man who sought recognition, but one who believed quietly in responsibility. Still, he had a habit, one that seemed small, almost invisible, that shaped more than he realized. He said yes too easily, not because he was forced to, but because he never quite learned how to say no. "You said you'd be home today," Margaret said, her voice measured but edged with something harder beneath. She stood near the window, arms loosely folded, her gaze fixed on him. "It's our anniversary, David." "I know," he replied gently, not defensive, just careful. "I didn't plan this." The call had come earlier that morning. A colleague, someone younger, someone with a child, needed help. Just a few hours, just enough to cover something unexpected. Margaret turned slightly, her expression tightening. There's always something, isn't there? Someone else's problem that suddenly becomes yours. "It's not like that," David said quietly. But to her, it always was. "You don't have to say yes every time," she continued, her voice firmer now. "Sometimes I wonder if anything in this house ever comes before your work." The words lingered longer than she expected. David paused, just for a moment. "I'll be back before lunch," he said, softer this time. But something in his voice had changed. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence between them said enough. In the hallway, unnoticed, Micheltra stood still. At 22, Micheltra was already someone who observed more than he spoke. His short, dark hair fell slightly out of place, his features sharper than they would be years later, his expression often unreadable. There was a quiet intensity in him, not loud, not obvious, but present in the way he watched, the way he remembered. And he remembered everything. The tone, the words, the pause. Most of all, the hesitation. David reached for his coat, a dark, slightly worn jacket resting over the chair, and moved toward the door. He stopped briefly, glancing back, as if something inside him had not yet settled. For a moment, it seemed like he might stay. But then, "I'll be back soon," he said, and he left. That hesitation would stay with Micheltra longer than anything else. Later that morning, the world shifted in ways no one could fully understand at the time. The news came in fragments. Voices overlapping, images repeating, uncertainty filling every space where clarity should have been. Smoke rising into a sky that had started the day so quietly. Margaret sat in front of the television, her body completely still, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if holding on to something that was already slipping away. Her expression, once composed, had collapsed into something unrecognizable. "No," she whispered. Behind her, Micheltra stood watching, waiting, for something that never came. Hours passed, but time no longer felt real. Then came the confirmation that wasn't really confirmation, only the absence of hope. David Collins was not coming home. Grief did not arrive gently. It fractured, it disoriented, it left spaces where answers should have been. And for Micheltra, those spaces became unbearable. At first, it didn't make sense. Then it began to hurt. And slowly, it needed somewhere to go. His mind returned again and again, not to the chaos on the screen, but to the quiet conversation that had come before it. You don't have to say yes every time. We had plans. Sometimes I wonder if anything in this house ever comes before your work. The words shifted, changed, took on meaning they hadn't carried before, until they pointed somewhere, at her. Blaming her didn't bring his father back, but it gave his pain somewhere to land. In the weeks that followed, Margaretry tried to reach him, not with force, not with demands, but with something softer, something unfamiliar even to herself. "Michael," she said one evening, her voice quieter than it had ever been, "we'll figure this out." He didn't look at her, because every time he did, he saw that moment again, the hesitation, the door closing. "It's already figured out," he said flatly. She stood there, not fully understanding what she had lost in that moment. She didn't believe she had caused it, but she could no longer prove that she hadn't. That uncertainty settled deep, and over time, it changed her. Years passed, but distance, once chosen, rarely softens. It hardens. Margaret, no longer Margaretry, no longer the woman who believed she could control the shape of her life, became someone else. The softness in her voice faded, her patience thinned. The world became something sharper, because that was how it had turned toward her. Every attempt she made to reconnect met the same quiet resistance. Calls unanswered, visits shortened, words left unfinished. Once, years later, she stood outside Michael's apartment in Boston. She had dressed carefully that day, her hair neat, her coat pressed, her posture still carrying a trace of the woman she used to be. Her hand hovered near the doorbell. She didn't press it. Instead, she lowered her hand and stepped back. White Plains wasn't where she started over. It was where she stopped trying. The house she moved into was smaller, quieter, easier to manage, easier to disappear inside. Neighbors came and went, but Margaret kept her distance. Conversations were brief, polite when necessary, sharp when not. Eventually, people stopped trying, and she let them. Because silence, at least, did not accuse her of anything. But silence has a way of growing, of filling every space where something once mattered. And in that silence, the blame remained. Not spoken, not questioned, just carried. For years, Margaret lived with it. And for years, Michael believed it. What neither of them knew was that the truth had always been there. Just never where they chose to look. Only the version of it they had needed to believe in order to survive. Morning settled gently over White Plains beneath a pale, overcast sky, the cold light pressing softly against the windows of Margaret Collins' house, where even the air seemed to move with caution, as if it had learned long ago not to disturb what grief had left behind. Margaret Collins, now 71, moved through the house with the slow care of someone who no longer trusted her own balance. Her silver-gray hair fell softly around her shoulders, thinner than it had once been, and her pale skin carried the fine lines and age spots of a life that had lasted longer than she ever expected it to feel. Her posture, once elegant and upright, had begun to bend almost imperceptibly, not only from age, but from years of carrying what she never put down. Yet there was still a hardness in the set of her jaw, a quiet refusal in the way she held herself, as though even now she would rather argue with the world than admit it was wearing her down. The house had not changed, only the life inside it had. Once the rooms had held warmth, music playing softly in the kitchen, the sound of David's voice coming down the hallway, the ordinary noise of people who still expected tomorrow to look familiar. Now the rooms felt preserved rather than lived in. Dust had settled into corners that Margaret no longer bothered to notice. Framed photographs lined the walls, some slightly crooked, their glass dulled by time. One photograph near the staircase showed David standing beside a younger Margaret, his smile open, hers controlled but luminous, the kind of smile she had worn when life still obeyed her. Margaret glanced at it only by accident and immediately looked away. The pain of remembrance had not lessened with time. It had only become quieter. In the kitchen, she stopped suddenly. Something was wrong. Not loud, not obvious, just wrong. Then she smelled it. Burned butter. A faint, bitter scent hanging in the air like a warning that it arrived too late. Margaret turned toward the stove and saw a small saucepan sitting over a low flame. She stared at it for a second too long, as though the sight needed explaining. Then she reached forward and turned the burner off. At the bottom of the pan, a dark mark had already formed, a thin black crescent where the heat had lingered unattended. She stood there, one hand resting on the counter. She murmured, but the sentence went nowhere. That was happening more often now, thoughts that began as if they belonged to her, only to disappear before they became complete. Small things, she told herself, trivial things, the kinds of lapses everyone had at her age. But the most frightening part was not what she forgot. It was how often she didn't realize she was forgetting. A sharp knock sounded at the front door. Margaret flinched slightly, more from irritation than surprise. Visitors were rare. That had not happened by accident. Over the years, she had made herself difficult enough that most people learned not to try twice. She opened the door only halfway. On the porch stood Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, a woman in her late 60s with short, softly curled gray hair and warm brown eyes that seemed to look at people with patience before judgment. Her figure was slightly rounded, her posture relaxed, and she wore a pale blue cardigan over a faded floral dress, practical shoes peeking out beneath the hem. There was a steadiness to her, the kind that came from having seen pain up close and learning not to be frightened by it. Years earlier, Eleanor had cared for her own older sister through a long decline that had begun with harmless mistakes and ended with names forgotten, rooms unrecognized, and grief that stretched on even after death. Because of that, she had learned to notice what other people preferred not to see. "Good morning, Margaret," Eleanor said softly, holding a covered dish in both hands. "I made too much vegetable soup again. Thought I'd save you the trouble of lunch." Margaret looked first at the dish, then at Eleanor, her expression sharpening with automatic resistance. "I don't need taking care of," she said. "I know," Eleanor replied, not missing a beat. "That's why I called it soup and not help." For the briefest moment, something almost like amusement moved through Margaret's face, but it vanished so quickly it might have been imagined. "I'm busy," she said. Eleanor nodded once. "Then I won't stay." She still didn't step back. Margaret noticed that and felt irritated by how gently the woman held her ground. Finally, with a tired exhale she did not want to be heard, Margaret opened the door wider. "Leave it in the kitchen." Eleanor entered quietly, not with the clumsy curiosity of someone snooping, but with the careful awareness of someone who understood that houses could reveal things their owners tried to hide. She saw the dust, the untouched mail stacked near the hallway table, the silence that seemed too large for one person. She noticed the saucepan in the sink and the faint smell of something burned. She said nothing. "That's a lovely coat hook," Eleanor said instead, glancing toward the hallway wall where David's dark coat still hung. "Looks old." Margaret's face changed at once, the softness vanishing. "It is." Eleanor accepted the boundary immediately. "There's a church gathering on Saturday," she said as she set the dish on the table. "Not really a church thing, more just coffee and people pretending they aren't lonely. You'd be welcome." Margaret gave a dismissive wave. "I don't care for gatherings." "No," Eleanor said gently, "but sometimes gatherings care for us anyway." Margaret turned away, pretending to straighten a placemat that did not need straightening. "I said no." Eleanor studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but the invitation stays even if you don't." After Eleanor left, Margaret stood in the doorway longer than necessary. The porch was empty. The neighborhood was quiet again. She closed the door slowly and returned to the kitchen, where the dish of soup sat on the table as if it had always belonged there. She frowned. For one strange second, she could not remember opening the door. She could not remember agreeing to let Eleanor in. The realization unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Upstairs, the bedroom held the same careful stillness it always had. The curtains were half drawn, allowing weak daylight to spill across the bedspread. Margaret lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, and looked toward the far wall. David's coat hung neatly on the hook, dark, slightly worn, untouched except by memory. She stared at it for a long time. "David," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. The name left her mouth with a tenderness she no longer used on the living. "You're late." For a brief second, it did not feel like talking to the dead. It felt like waiting for someone familiar to answer from the next room. Her face softened. The tightness left her shoulders. The loneliness that had hardened inside her for years seemed to loosen just enough for her to breathe differently. Then confusion moved across her features. She blinked and looked around the room as though she had woken there unexpectedly. "What was I saying?" she murmured. The moment vanished, so quickly that even the loss of it felt incomplete. Miles away in Boston, Michael Collins spent his days inside a life built on structure. At 45, he had the controlled appearance of a man who had learned to keep every part of himself in order. His dark hair, touched now with gray at the temples, was kept short and neat. A light stubble framed the sharp lines of his jaw, and his expression had settled over the years into something composed enough to pass for calm. In the office, where glass walls reflected clean light and quiet ambition, Michael was known as reliable, efficient, and difficult to surprise. People trusted him with complicated problems because he rarely allowed emotion to interrupt function. What they did not know was that he had organized his life the same way one seals a damaged room, carefully, deliberately, and with the unspoken understanding that some doors should never be opened again. He almost never spoke about his mother, not because he had forgotten her, because he had not. That afternoon, while reviewing a financial report, his phone buzzed once on the desk. An unfamiliar number flashed on the screen. He let it ring out. A moment later, a voicemail notification appeared. He stared at it longer than necessary before pressing play. "Hello, Michael?" The voice was female, older, careful. "This is Eleanor Brooks. I live near your mother in White Plains. I hope you don't mind me calling. I found your number in an old address book." Michael sat back without realizing he had done so. "I just thought you should know she's having a little trouble. Nothing urgent today," Eleanor continued, choosing her words with obvious care. "But I've seen this sort of thing before. Small changes don't stay small forever." There was a pause on the message, the kind that held more concern than the words themselves. "She may not tell you, so I am." The voicemail ended. Michael set the phone down. For a long time, he did nothing. Then he picked it up again and stared at Eleanor's number on the screen. His thumb hovered over the call button. Calling back meant reopening something he had spent years trying to close. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled his hand away. He stood and crossed the office, stopping near the glass window. Below him, Boston moved with the indifferent rhythm of a weekday afternoon. Cars turned corners. People hurried with coffee cups and briefcases. Ordinary life went on, untouched by memory. But his mind had already returned somewhere else, to a hallway in Manhattan, to a pause at the front door, to his father's coat in his hand, to his mother's voice, restrained but wounded. "Sometimes I wonder if anything in this house ever comes before your work." Michael closed his eyes briefly. Distance, he had told himself, was necessary. Distance kept grief from turning into something worse. Distance made pain manageable. But distance had not erased anything. It had only allowed silence to grow around it. Back in White Plains, evening gathered quietly around Margaret's house. The soup Eleanor had brought remained untouched on the kitchen table. The television murmured softly in the living room, offering voices she did not need and company she did not feel. Margaret sat in her chair, hands folded, her eyes fixed not on the screen but somewhere beyond it, somewhere suspended between memory and loss. The silence between her and Michael was no longer just distance. It had become something they both lived inside. And beneath everything they had each chosen to believe, beneath the years, the blame, the unfinished grief, something else still waited, not gone, not buried deeply enough to disappear, only waiting for one of them to finally turn toward it. The change did not arrive like a revelation. It came quietly, almost unnoticed at first, slipping into Margaret Collins' life the way her memories had begun to slip away, softly, without permission and without explanation. A few days after her fall, the house in White Plains no longer felt exactly the same. Not warmer, not brighter, but lighter. Margaret moved through the kitchen one morning with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Her steps were still slow, her balance still cautious, but something in her expression had shifted. The sharpness that once lived permanently in her face, the quick irritation, the guarded resistance, had softened into something gentler. Her shoulders rested lower, her movements less defensive, as though she no longer expected the world to push back. She paused near the window, looking out at the quiet street. For a moment, she smiled. She didn't question it. She didn't know she should. On the kitchen counter sat a small yellow note, written in her own careful handwriting. "Call Michael." Margaret picked it up, holding it between her fingers as if the words belonged to someone else. Michael. The name felt familiar, important, but strangely distant. She frowned slightly, trying to follow the thought to wherever it had come from. Something stirred at the edge of her mind, something heavier, something she could almost recognize, but it slipped away before it could take shape. "Later," she murmured, placing the note back down. And just like that, the intention disappeared. For a brief second, her expression tightened again, as if something old had tried to return. Then it faded, as if it had never been there at all. Instead, she turned toward the oven. That morning, she baked. It wasn't planned. The ingredients had simply been there, arranged in a way that made sense to her hands, even if her mind could not explain why. Flour dusted lightly across the counter, sugar measured without hesitation, butter softened under her fingers. She didn't remember when she had last baked, but her hands did. There was a quiet rhythm to it, movements repeated with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than memory. The house slowly filled with warmth, with a scent that did not belong to silence. When the timer chimed, Margaret opened the oven and paused. The smell wrapped around her gently. For a moment, she closed her eyes, not remembering, just feeling. She smiled again, softly this time, almost like a secret, without remembering what she had once lost. Later that afternoon, she stood outside Eleanor Brooks' front door, holding a small plate of neatly arranged cookies. She hesitated before knocking, not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't entirely sure why she was there. Still, her hand lifted, and she knocked. When the door opened, Eleanor froze for half a second. Margaret stood there, shoulders slightly hunched, silver gray hair brushed gently by the wind, holding out the plate like someone offering something fragile. "I made too much," Margaret said simply. Eleanor accepted the plate slowly, her warm brown eyes studying Margaret's face with quiet attention. She had seen this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. Sudden softness was not always healing. Sometimes, it meant something else was slipping away. "They look lovely," Eleanor said gently. Margaret nodded, as if that completed the purpose of her visit. Then she turned and walked away without waiting for anything more. Eleanor remained in the doorway, watching her leave. Her expression didn't show alarm, but her thoughts had already begun to shift. Back inside Margaret's house, the warmth faded quickly. The cookies were gone. The purpose of making them had gone with them. Margaret stood in the living room, looking at the television without seeing it. The room no longer felt heavy in the same way it once had. It felt distant. On the small table beside her chair, several folded notes rested in a loose stack. She picked one up. "Call Michael." The words were written again, this time slightly uneven. Margaret stared at it longer than before. Then, slowly, she stood and walked toward the phone. She dialed the number carefully, her fingers moving with hesitation. She lifted the receiver. The line began to ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Margaret waited. But as she waited, something shifted again. The purpose blurred. Why was she calling? Who was Michael? By the 4th ring, confusion settled into her expression. She lowered the phone gently. The call ended before it could be answered. "I'll remember later," she whispered. But later never came. Instead, she reached for a pen, sat down at the table, and began to write. "Dear Michael," she wrote, her handwriting careful but slower than before. The words came easily. The memories behind them did not. She didn't write about arguments. She didn't write about distance. She didn't write about the morning that had broken everything, because those parts were no longer within reach. Instead, she wrote about sunlight in the park, about laughter that felt distant but warm, about watching a little boy run ahead of her, turning back just to make sure she was still there. "I would love to see you," she wrote. There was no apology, no explanation, only a quiet truth that remained when everything else had faded. She folded the letter neatly, placed it into an envelope, wrote his name with slow, deliberate strokes, then set it aside. The next morning, she mailed it, and forgot she had done so. Miles away in Boston, Michael Collins moved through his day with the same measured precision he had built his life upon. Meetings, reports, decisions, everything controlled, everything contained, until the letter arrived. It sat among other envelopes on his desk, indistinguishable at first, but something about the handwriting pulled his attention back to it. He picked it up. His name, written in a way he had not seen in years. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he held it, as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. Then, carefully, he unfolded the paper. His eyes moved across the lines, and slowed. Not because of what was written, but because of what wasn't. No blame, no tension, no reference to the past he had built his distance around. Only warmth, only memory, only something unfinished. Michael leaned back slightly, the letter still in his hands. His expression remained controlled, but something beneath it shifted. This wasn't the mother he remembered, and somehow, that unsettled him more than the silence ever had. He read the letter again, more slowly this time. Calling her back meant reopening something he had spent years trying to close. But not calling felt different now. For the first time in years, the distance no longer felt stable. It felt uncertain. Back in White Plains, Margaret sat quietly by the window, unaware that anything had changed beyond the walls of her home. The afternoon light rested gently across her face, and she smiled again, lightly, effortlessly. She felt lighter, not knowing what had been taken from her to make that possible. And somewhere, far beyond what she could remember, a letter had already begun to change everything. And this time, Michael would not ignore it. The first letter sat unopened on Michael Collins' desk for nearly an hour before he touched it again. It had arrived quietly, like everything else in his life now. No urgency, no demand, no expectation. Just paper, ink, and a name he had spent years trying not to hear unless absolutely necessary. He had already read it once, carefully, slowly, and yet something about it refused to settle. Michael leaned back in his chair, the letter still resting loosely between his fingers. His office in Boston remained unchanged around him. Glass walls, muted tones, a skyline that reflected stability and control. Everything in his world had been arranged with intention, built piece by piece to avoid disruption. But the letter did not fit into that structure. It didn't accuse him. It didn't ask anything of him. It simply existed. And that, somehow, made it harder to ignore. At first, he told himself it was just another attempt, another version of the same pattern he had seen before. His mother reaching out, not to reconnect, but to remind him of something he had already decided not to revisit. So he folded the letter again, set it aside, and returned to work. But later that afternoon, he found himself looking at it again, not directly, just aware of it. The handwriting, the way his name had been written, not rushed, not forceful, but careful. Familiar in a way that didn't carry the weight he expected. The second letter arrived 2 days later. This time he opened it immediately, not out of urgency, but curiosity. "Dear Michael," it began again, the same steady handwriting, the same quiet tone. He read it once, then again. There was no mention of the past, no attempt to explain anything, no effort to justify, just small moments, simple things, the kind of memories that did not argue, the kind that did not defend themselves. Michael frowned slightly, his brow tightening as he reached the end. This wasn't right. It wasn't how he remembered her. Margaret Collins, in his mind, had always been composed but distant, controlled but sharp. Even in her attempts to reconnect years ago, there had been tension, something unresolved sitting beneath every word. But this felt different. He placed the letter beside the first one, and for the first time in years, he didn't immediately push the thought away. Instead, he let it sit, uncomfortable, unfinished. The third letter arrived the following week. By then, Michael was expecting it, not consciously, but enough that when the envelope appeared among the rest of his mail, he noticed it before anything else. He didn't open it right away. He turned it over in his hands, studied the edges, the slight unevenness in the fold, as if it had been handled more carefully than necessary. Then, slowly, he opened it. His eyes moved across the page, and stopped. "I don't remember exactly when we stopped talking," Margaret had written, "but I don't think it could have been only one person's fault." Michael read the sentence again, then a third time. Something shifted. Not in the letter, in him. For years his memory had been clear, sharp, defined, anchored to that morning. The argument, the hesitation, the door closing. It had always made sense, simple, direct. But now, there was a gap, a space where certainty had been. And for the first time, he noticed it. His jaw tightened slightly as he leaned back in his chair. This wasn't the mother he remembered. And somehow, that unsettled him more than if she had remained the same. Because anger, at least, had been predictable. This was not. Michael stood and walked toward the window, the letter still in his hand. Outside, the city moved with its usual rhythm. People passing by, traffic flowing, life continuing without interruption. But his thoughts had already stepped outside that rhythm, back to a place he had kept sealed, a hallway in Manhattan, a voice behind him, a pause that had lasted longer than it should have. He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a brief moment. Blaming her had made things easier. It had given shape to something that otherwise would have remained impossible to hold. But what if? The thought didn't finish. He didn't let it. Not yet. Back at his desk, the three letters now lay side by side. Different days, different words, but the same tone. The same absence of accusation. The same quiet presence of something he could not immediately define. That night, Michael did something he had not done in years. He brought the letters home. His apartment, unlike his office, held more of him. Books stacked unevenly on a shelf, a jacket thrown carelessly over a chair, the quiet signs of a life lived alone. Still structured, but less controlled. He sat at the dining table, the letters spread out in front of him, and he read them again. This time more slowly, looking not for what was written, but for what was missing. And what he found unsettled him. There was no manipulation, no guilt, no attempt to draw him back through obligation. Only presence, as if she were simply reaching out without expectation of being answered. Michael leaned back slightly, his fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the table. He didn't understand it, and that lack of understanding was beginning to matter more than the anger he had held for years. The fourth letter arrived 3 days later. By then, something had already begun to shift. He opened it without hesitation. "Dear Michael," it read, "I hope you're doing well. I was thinking about the time we went to the park and you ran ahead of me, then stopped to make sure I was still there. I remember feeling proud of you. I still do. Michael's grip on the paper tightened slightly. The memory was real. He could see it, feel it, but it had never been part of the version of the past he had chosen to keep. He lowered the letter slowly, and for the first time in years, something unfamiliar moved through him. Not anger, not resistance, something quieter, something heavier. Regret. He exhaled slowly, his eyes drifting toward the window. Calling her back meant reopening everything, but not calling no longer felt like control. It felt like avoidance. And avoidance, he realized, had not healed anything. It had only delayed it. Back in White Plains, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, a blank piece of paper in front of her. The pen rested in her hand, unmoving. She wasn't sure what she had already written. She wasn't sure what she had already sent. But she knew one thing. There was someone she cared about, someone she wanted to reach, even if she could no longer fully remember why. She leaned forward slightly and began again. "Dear Michael," she wrote. Her handwriting wavered just slightly more than before, but the words came anyway. Simple, uncomplicated, true in a way that no longer needed memory to support it. Miles away, Michael sat in silence, the letters spread out before him. For years, he had believed he understood the past. Now, for the first time, he wasn't sure. And that uncertainty was beginning to feel like the beginning of something else. The letters did not ask for answers. They did something more dangerous. They made Michael Collins question the ones he already had. For years, his understanding of the past had been fixed, unchallenged, reinforced by repetition. He had returned to it the same way a person returns to a familiar road, without thinking, without questioning where it led, only trusting that it had always made sense. But now, sitting alone in his apartment with the letters spread across his table, that certainty no longer felt as solid as it once had. It felt incomplete. Michael sat in silence, one hand resting against the edge of the table, the other holding the third letter. His eyes lingered on the line that had unsettled him more than anything else. I don't think it could have been only one person's fault. He exhaled slowly. For the first time in 20 years, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that his memory, so carefully preserved, so fiercely protected, might not have been entirely accurate. That possibility alone was enough to shift something deep within him. The next morning, instead of going straight to work, Michael drove to a place he had not visited in years, a storage facility on the outskirts of the city. The building was plain, industrial, lined with rows of identical metal doors. It held the kind of things people did not need daily, but could not bring themselves to discard. Old furniture, boxes of photographs, fragments of lives that no longer fit neatly into the present. Michael unlocked his unit slowly. Inside, the air was still, faintly stale. Dust clung to surfaces that had not been disturbed in years. He stepped inside, his movements measured, his expression controlled, though something beneath it had already begun to shift. There were boxes stacked neatly against the wall, labeled in his own handwriting. Documents. Personal. Dad. He paused at the last one. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he crouched down and opened it. Inside were folders, envelopes, and old papers, records from a time he had chosen not to revisit. He flipped through them carefully, his fingers slower than usual, as though each piece of paper carried weight beyond what it showed. Near the bottom of the box, he found a worn manila folder, unlabeled. He opened it. Inside were printed emails, work schedules, internal notes, the kind of routine documents that meant nothing, until they didn't. Michael scanned the pages, his eyes moving quickly at first, then slowing, then stopping. A single line caught his attention. Shift reassignment confirmed. David Collins covering for Jay Reynolds. Emergency family request. Michael frowned slightly. He read it again. Then again. The words did not change, but their meaning did. His brow tightened as he flipped to the next page. Another internal message. Appreciate you stepping in, Dave. I owe you one. James. Michael's hands stilled. James Reynolds. The name surfaced faintly in his memory. Someone his father had mentioned once or twice, a colleague, younger, recently married at the time. Michael leaned back slightly, the papers still in his hand. Something was wrong. Or rather, something he had believed for years, no longer aligned. For as long as he could remember, he had held on to a single explanation, that his father had gone back to work that day because he felt obligated, because of pressure, because of responsibility, because of everything that had been said that morning, because of her. But this suggested something else entirely. Michael stood slowly, the folder still open in his hands, and walked toward the small desk at the back of the unit. He set the papers down, his gaze fixed on the lines in front of him as if they might rearrange themselves into something easier to accept. They didn't. Instead, something else began to surface. Not from the documents, from memory. A different version. Quieter, less certain. He remembered his father's voice, not strained, not pressured, but calm. "I'll cover for him," David had said. Not reluctantly, not defensively, simply deciding. Michael closed his eyes briefly, the image forming more clearly now. His father had always been like that, stepping in, taking on more than he needed to, not because he was forced to, but because he chose to. The realization settled slowly, then, all at once. Michael opened his eyes again, his gaze dropping back to the paper in front of him. The shift had not been demanded, it had been given, freely. And in that moment, the foundation of everything he had believed for the past 2 decades began to crack. He sank down into the chair behind him, his hands resting heavily against his knees. The silence in the storage unit felt different now, not empty, but filled with something he had never allowed himself to see. For years, he had built a story that made the pain easier to hold, a cause, a reason, a place to direct the anger that grief had created. He had chosen her, because it had made everything simpler, because it had allowed him to avoid something far more difficult. The truth that there had been no one to blame. Michael leaned forward, pressing his hands together tightly. His breathing slowed, then deepened. He remembered the morning again, the argument, the words. But now, something else stood out, the hesitation, not as pressure, but as choice. David had paused, not because he was forced, but because he was deciding, and he had decided. The weight of that realization settled into Michael's chest, heavier than anything he had carried before, because it meant something he was not prepared to face. It meant that the years of distance, the silence, the anger had been built on something incomplete, something he had never questioned, until now. He looked down at the letters again, their softness, their absence of blame, their quiet insistence on connection without demand. And suddenly, they made sense. Not because she was pretending, but because she no longer carried what he had believed she did. Michael exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping in a way they hadn't in years. Guilt did not arrive gently. It came sharp, sudden, unavoidable. It moved through him with a clarity that left no space for resistance. He had been wrong. Not entirely, but enough. Enough to change everything. For a long moment, he sat there in silence, the weight of realization settling into something he could not undo, but something he could still respond to. He stood abruptly, the movement sharper than anything he had done all morning. The decision came without hesitation. He reached for his phone, scrolled through his contacts, stopped at her name, Margaret. His thumb hovered for a second, then pulled back. No, not like this. Not over a call that could end too quickly. Not after everything that had been left unsaid for so long. He lowered the phone, picked up the letters instead, folded them carefully, and placed them inside his jacket. Then he turned toward the door of the storage unit and stepped out into the open air. The sky above Boston was clear, the late afternoon light stretching across the horizon in quiet contrast to the storm that had just passed through him. For the first time in years, Michael did not feel controlled. He felt uncertain, and strangely, that uncertainty did not weaken him. It moved him towards something he had avoided for far too long. Back in White Plains, Margaret sat quietly by the kitchen table, a fresh piece of paper in front of her. The pen rested lightly between her fingers. She wasn't sure what she had already written. She wasn't sure what she had already sent, but she knew she was waiting. For something. For someone. She leaned forward and began again. "Dear Michael," she wrote. Her handwriting wavered slightly, but the words still came. Simple, gentle, unaware of the weight they now carried. Miles away, Michael got into his car, started the engine, and for the first time in over 20 years, he began the drive home. The drive felt longer than it should have. Michael Collins kept both hands on the steering wheel, his posture steady, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. But his thoughts moved far beyond it. The miles between Boston and White Plains passed quietly, the rhythm of the highway steady and uninterrupted, yet nothing inside him felt settled. The letters rested on the passenger seat beside him, carefully folded, as if they carried more weight than anything he had brought with him. He had imagined this moment before. Not often, but enough. In those imagined versions, there had always been confrontation. Words held back for too long finally spoken. Questions answered. Anger resolved, or, at the very least, understood. But now, none of that felt certain anymore. The closer he got, the less he knew what he was returning to. By the time he reached the familiar streets of White Plains, the late afternoon light had begun to soften. The neighborhood looked almost unchanged. Quiet houses, trimmed lawns, the same stillness that had always defined the place. Time had passed, but it had not announced itself here. Michael parked the car a short distance from the house. For a moment, he didn't move. The engine idled softly before he turned it off. Silence followed. He sat there, his hands still resting on the wheel, his breathing slow, controlled, but heavier than usual. Then, finally, he stepped out. The house stood exactly as he remembered it. Not new, not restored, but preserved. As if it had been waiting. Michael walked up the short path, each step measured, each movement deliberate. The closer he got to the front door, the more his certainty faded. Not into doubt, but into something quieter, something more honest. He raised his hand and knocked. The sound echoed faintly through the house. No answer. He waited. Then knocked again, softer this time. The door opened slowly. It wasn't Margaret who stood there. It was Eleanor Brooks. She looked at him for a brief moment, her warm brown eyes searching his face, as if confirming something she had already suspected. "You must be Michael," she said gently. Michael nodded once. "I am." Eleanor stepped aside without another question. "She's inside." Her voice held no surprise, only quiet understanding. Michael entered the house slowly. The air felt the same, still, familiar, carrying the faint scent of something warm, something recently made. But there was something else too, something lighter. He moved through the hallway, his gaze briefly catching the framed photographs, the edges worn with time, the memories inside them untouched but no longer heavy in the same way. Then he saw her. Margaret sat near the window, her hands resting gently in her lap, the afternoon light falling softly across her face. Her silver-gray hair framed her features, thinner than he remembered, her posture slightly bent, but there was a calmness in her expression that stopped him where he stood. It was not the face he had carried in his memory, it was softer. He took a step closer. The floor creaked lightly beneath him. Margaret turned her head, their eyes met, and she smiled. Not cautiously, not uncertainly, but openly, as if she were seeing something familiar, even if she could not name it. Michael felt something tighten in his chest. "Hi," he said quietly. The word felt smaller than everything he had carried with him. Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying him in a way that was neither distant nor guarded, just curious. "You look," she began softly, her voice warm, almost thoughtful. She paused, then smiled again. "You look like someone very important to me." The words landed gently, but their meaning did not. Michael's breath caught. For a moment he couldn't respond, because in that single sentence, something became clear in a way nothing else had prepared him for. She didn't recognize him. Not fully, not the way he had once imagined. The realization did not come like shock. It came quietly, and it stayed. Michael nodded slowly, forcing a small smile in return. "I hope so," he said. His voice held, but just barely. Eleanor remained near the doorway, her presence quiet, unobtrusive, as if she understood that this moment did not belong to her. Michael walked closer and sat down in the chair across from Margaret. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then he leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together. "My name is Michael," he said. The words felt unfamiliar in this context, like an introduction he had never expected to make. Margaret repeated the name softly, as if testing it. "Michael," she nodded. "I like that name," she said gently. Michael let out a small breath that almost became a laugh, though it never fully formed. "I'm glad." He hesitated, then continued. "I used to come here a lot." Margaret's eyes stayed on him, attentive, open, as if she were listening without the weight of expectation. "Did you?" she asked. Michael nodded. "When I was younger." He paused again, searching for the right place to begin. Not the argument, not the distance, but something else. Something she might still feel, even if she could no longer remember it. "There was a park nearby," he said slowly. "We used to go there. I would run ahead and then stop to make sure you were still behind me." Margaret's expression softened. A faint recognition, not of memory, but of emotion, moved through her eyes. "That sounds like something I would have liked," she said. Michael swallowed. "You did." The silence that followed was different from the silence they had lived in for years. It was not empty, it was not defensive, it simply was. Margaret reached forward slightly, her hand moving with quiet hesitation before resting gently over his. The contact was light, careful, but unmistakably real. "You seem kind," she said. Michael looked down at their hands. For a moment, everything he had held on to, anger, certainty, distance, felt impossibly far away. "I wasn't always," he said quietly. Margaret didn't respond to that, not because she disagreed, but because the context no longer existed for her. Instead, she smiled again and held his hand just a little tighter. Michael stayed. He didn't check the time. He didn't think about leaving. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to explain anything, to correct anything, or to defend anything. He simply remained where he was, beside her, listening, speaking when it felt right, letting the space between them fill with something new, or perhaps something that had always been there, waiting beneath everything else. Outside, the light began to fade slowly into evening. Eleanor moved quietly through the house, giving them space, her presence steady but distant. At one point, she passed by the living room and glanced in. Margaret was still holding Michael's hand, and Michael was no longer looking at the past. He was looking at her. Back inside that moment, Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression calm, her eyes soft. "I'm glad you came," she said. Michael nodded. "So am I." And for the first time in a very long time, it was true. The house felt different now, not because it had changed, but because Michael had. He stood in the kitchen early one morning, sleeves rolled up, carefully measuring coffee into a small machine that looked far newer than anything else in the house. The sunlight slipped quietly through the window, settling across the worn countertops, touching the edges of things that had once felt frozen in time. Now they felt lived in again. Michael had not returned to Boston. Not yet. What had begun as a visit had stretched into days, then weeks, and eventually into a decision he could no longer pretend was temporary. He had taken a leave at first, an extended personal adjustment, as his firm had phrased it. But the distance from that life had only made one thing clearer. He didn't want to go back. Not in the same way. The routines that had once defined him, the meetings, the structure, the control, now felt distant, almost unnecessary. In their place, something quieter had begun to form, something less certain, but more real. Margaret sat by the window, as she often did, her hands resting gently in her lap, her silver-gray hair catching the light in soft strands. She seemed smaller than before, but not weaker, just lighter. She turned when she heard him moving and smiled. Always that same smile, not one of recognition, but one of comfort. "You're here," she said softly. Michael nodded. "I am." He didn't correct her. He didn't explain. He simply let the moment exist as it was. That had become his way now. Not forcing memory, not searching for what had been lost, but building something new in its place. Later that morning, they sat together at the small kitchen table. A plate of toast rested between them, slightly uneven, one slice more brown than the other. Margaret picked up a piece, studying it with quiet curiosity, as if it were something both familiar and new. "You made this?" she asked. Michael smiled faintly. "I did." She nodded slowly, taking a small bite. "It's good," she said, with a softness that carried more weight than the words themselves. Michael leaned back slightly in his chair, watching her, not with the urgency he once would have felt, but with patience, with acceptance. He had learned that progress here did not look like restoration. It looked like presence. In the afternoons, he would sit with her in the living room, sometimes reading aloud from the letters she had written, letters she no longer remembered. At first, he had hesitated. He wasn't sure if it would confuse her or hurt her, but it did neither. Instead, she listened. Not as someone reclaiming memory, but as someone discovering something true. "You sound kind," she had said once, after he finished reading. Michael had paused, the paper still in his hands. "She always was," he replied quietly. Margaret smiled at that, as if she believed it. And in that moment, so did he. A few days later, Eleanor Brooks stopped by in the early afternoon, knocking lightly before letting herself in the way she had grown accustomed to. She carried a small basket of groceries, her movements steady despite the slight stiffness in her joints. Eleanor was a woman in her late 60s, her short gray curls framing a face shaped by both kindness and experience. Her eyes missed very little, though she rarely spoke more than necessary. Years earlier, she had cared for her own husband through a long illness, a quiet chapter of her life that had taught her how to recognize both decline and dignity when they appeared together. She stepped into the kitchen and paused, observing the scene before her. Michael standing at the counter, Margaret sitting calmly, watching him. The air between them, different. "You've settled in," Eleanor said gently. Michael turned, offering a small nod. "Trying to." Eleanor set the basket down, her gaze soft but knowing. "It suits you," she added. Michael didn't respond right away, but the faint shift in his expression suggested that he understood what she meant. That evening, after Margaret had gone to bed, Michael sat alone at the table, the letters spread out in front of him once more. He read them differently now, not as messages from the past, but as reminders of something that had never truly disappeared. Love had not been lost, it had only been buried beneath grief. And grief, he realized, had a way of rewriting everything if left alone long enough. He leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly. For years, he had believed he was holding on to something important by keeping his distance. Now, he understood, he had only been holding on to pain. The next morning, Michael made a call, not to Boston, but to a smaller firm closer to White Plains. The conversation was simple, direct. Within a week, arrangements had begun to shift. A new role, less demanding, closer. Not a step back, but a step inward. That afternoon, he told Margaret. "I might be staying here for a while," he said. She looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "I think I'd like that," she replied. Michael smiled. "So would I." Days passed quietly, not marked by dramatic change, but by consistency, by small moments, shared meals, conversations that drifted without direction, silences that no longer felt empty. And then, one afternoon, something unexpected happened. They were sitting by the window, the same place where everything had once begun to shift. The light was soft, the kind that made the world feel slower. Margaret looked at him, not briefly, but fully, as if something had come into focus, even if only for a second. Her brow furrowed slightly, then smoothed, and she said it. "Michael." The name came clearly, without hesitation, without confusion, just once. Michael froze. The sound of it settled into the room, quiet but undeniable. For a moment, neither of them moved. Margaret blinked softly, her expression shifting again, the clarity fading as quickly as it had arrived. But it didn't matter, because it had happened. Michael let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. A small smile formed, not from surprise, but from something deeper. Understanding. He didn't ask her to repeat it. He didn't try to hold on to it. He simply accepted it. For what it was. A moment. Not a return, but a reminder. That something, somewhere inside her, still remained. Margaret reached for his hand again, the gesture as natural as it had become. "You're kind," she said softly. Michael nodded. "I'm trying to be." And this time, he meant it. The sun began to set slowly outside the window, casting long shadows across the room. Michael sat beside her, his hand resting in hers, his gaze no longer searching for what had been lost, but resting in what was still there. Their story had not returned to what it once was. It had become something else, something quieter, something simpler, but perhaps something stronger. Because this time there was no blame, no expectation, no past to rewrite. Only two people learning how to love each other again, in a way that asked for nothing and gave everything.
In the end, Michael and Margaret didn't return to the life they once had. Instead, they discovered something deeper, something quieter but more meaningful. Through loss, misunderstanding, and years of silence, they learned that love doesn't disappear. It simply waits, sometimes beneath pain, sometimes beneath time itself. Margaret may have lost pieces of her memory, but she never lost the part of her that loved her son. And Michael, in facing the truth, found not only forgiveness, but a new way to be present. Their story reminds us that healing doesn't always mean going back. Sometimes it means moving forward with compassion, patience, and grace. In our own lives, we all carry wounds, regrets, and unanswered questions. But it's never too late to choose connection, to soften our hearts, and to begin again. Maybe this story found you today for a reason. Maybe there's someone in your life you've been meaning to call, forgive, or simply sit beside again. Sometimes the smallest moments become the greatest miracles. We may not always understand God's timing, but He has a way of restoring what truly matters. Not always as it was, but as it needs to be. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and who you're grateful for today. And if you believe in second chances, in healing, and in quiet miracles, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. May God bless you, bring peace to your heart, and guide you toward the people who matter most.